Thank you for tuning in to this final episode of Gods, Demons, and Magic. This is your host, Sri Satchidananda Das. So after completing the Egyptian mysteries, we're sort of speaking about a few more topics, almost an appendix to the podcast. And we're talking about the priesthood of ancient Egypt, as well as the process of initiation, or how one became qualified for the revelation of more and more secret and sacred knowledge, and how one gained access to these secret symbols which were used in the rituals as discussed previously to contact these supernatural beings. And the various priests of the various cults would use these magic rituals for the benefit of the community. There's many individuals engaged on all sorts of levels using magic in order to help everyone all together in a society. It was like their service to the Egyptian people. For example, there was an individual known as the feather bearer, and he was a priest who he wore 2 ostrich feathers on his head, and he used magic to fight the enemies of the state. Right? So he was constantly engaged in, conjuring various types of daemons, and archons and these different entities to fight against, the Hyksos or the Hittites or whoever the enemies of the Egyptian people were. In fact, you can almost suspect that you see the story in the Bible when Moses is fighting against, Ramses, and the Moses has his staff, which devours the staffs of the priests. Ramses calls these Egyptian priests forward, and they perform some miracles, and Moses is able to do the same miracles and ultimately to defeat them. So we can imagine that these priests that were called forward by Ramses are probably similar to these feather bearers. They're individuals that battle using magic on behalf of the state. And so they're always performing rituals in order to destroy the enemies, right? And there's also a certain priest who's known as the conjurer of scorpions. And his job is to perform magic rituals to sort of stave off the incessant attacks by scorpions and snakes and crocodiles within the country. Now, obviously, living along the Nile, it must have been terrifying for people, the crocodiles that are there and the various poisonous snakes in the water. You can imagine if you're you're harvesting your crops ankle deep in water, you're terrified that you're going to get bit by a snake or something. And so his job was to perform rituals that sort of appease these different types of entities. You might imagine that he would worship the daemons associated with these particular types of animals, right? And by satisfying that daemon, then the people are in general protected. There'll be less crocodile attacks, The women can get water from the river without fear of a crocodile jumping out and grabbing them, or grabbing their children or something. So this is a very important position. And so they would be engaged constantly in moving throughout the kingdom and performing these rituals. And then also there's a priest of Sekhmet, and he would perform... He was almost like a veterinarian. Like he would check all the various animals that were sacrificed to the gods and make sure that they were offerable, make sure they're healthy and everything like that. And he would perform rituals to appease Sekhmet, and she's considered a very dangerous goddess. And if she gets mad, which apparently would happen very easily, then she could bring in pestilence, right? In fact, when the Nile rose and fell, like after the flooding, it was a common time that there was pestilence, there was disease, cholera, and all sorts of diseases like this would come, because the whole place would become like a swamp, right? And so his job was to appease her and make sure that she's happy, and then less and less there'll be these horrible tragedies of disease arising. And it's also interesting that the priests weren't the only ones that were initiated into cults. Practically every form of career or specialty had its own particular cult. Like you might have an initiation into a guild, right? There might be the guild of carpenters or embalmers or masons or fishermen. And in order to enter this guild and be given the authority to practice your particular form of work, you had to prove that you had that level of knowledge and proficiency. Just like the priests, they were educated in philosophy and also into how to perform these rituals, how to write as scribes and all these things. And they had to demonstrate by taking tests, that they're actually educated. So similarly, to enter a guild as like a carpenter or a mason, you had to show that you knew how to use all the tools and everything like that. But you also had to show that you understood the cult associated with that particular skill. like the implements of the carpenter, like his saw or his measuring staff or whatever it may be. There would be sacred names associated with these. They would almost be like deified. In fact, you'll see in the ancient Egyptian traditions, many seemingly mundane things would be deified on a certain level. Kind of like in ancient Japan, they have the idea that like if a certain object is around, it could be like a pot or something, that or a cup or something that's within a family for 100 years or maybe longer, then it's sort of like it has its own spirit, almost like it comes alive, right? So there's very similar conceptions within the Egyptian tradition that many mundane things, they develop a kind of spiritual power or importance to them. And so these various implements that were used, these tools that were used in these guilds, they oftentimes developed like a god associated with them or a daemon associated with that particular tool. And you had to be familiar with the cult of that daemon. And we can imagine there must have been rituals also. All the carpenters have to get together and perform their rituals, and they bring out their implements, right? And you'll see this sort of echo today in various mystery school traditions, like in the Masonic traditions. And so many priests also, like one of the most common jobs for the priesthood of Egypt was to be like a doorkeeper, right? And you walk through the temple, and in all the different passageways and stuff, they're guards. They're basically priests that make sure only certain individuals enter into restricted areas. And so they're checking to make sure that you're an initiate. You have to know the various signs and symbols. And also you see, like we mentioned of the Masons and these different mystery schools also, there's various signs and symbols that they're initiated, various movements of the hand, and like you can indicate to someone that you're an initiate, and they understand by how you stand or the various shapes you make with your hand and things like that, the clothing that you wear, that you're actually a member of this secret initiated priesthood. And so it was very much like that in the temple. You had to know the secret hand signs and things like that, and then you're allowed to enter into a particular portion of the temple. And so you had to be, like the process of initiation was one where this theurgy was practiced. And in many ways it was understood that if you're initiated into the priesthood, you had seen the gods. You'd actually gone through one of these theurgic rituals and actually seen the direct manifestation of a god before you. And this was kind of like your initiation, Can you imagine that? Like you actually enter into the initiation ceremony, and it's so powerful that an archangel appears, or Ra himself or something, and you're filled with that spiritual experience. As we mentioned previously, when the gods appear within a certain ritual, it has the effect of drawing you into almost like a trance, into a certain vision where you can't see anything else in reality. Like all you see is the God. The world sort of disappears, and you're absorbed in this divine flaming vision, which is just kind of overwhelming, almost unapproachable. And you see, they're surrounded by their retinue, smaller gods, and you can also see the elements of the universe that they control are all around them. Like say, for example, if it's a god of fire, you would see, fire blazing and all throughout in all directions. And so, and the overall experience is that your consciousness is raised. You're immediately filled with a sense of divinity, and you understand the path of self-realization. And afterwards you feel, very spiritually elevated and peaceful. Like your consciousness has been totally purified. And so you leave the initiation ceremony a changed person, right? Like when it's basically you meet the God, and then that's when you're initiated, and you have a totally different perspective on life and on your purpose in life and what you're going to do, and it sort of develops within you not only the determination to practice the priesthood properly and to follow all the stringent rules and stuff like that, but it also gives you the purpose that you're going to follow it for. Now you understand the reason for the priesthood. You have sort of this divine depth of vision has been given to you of the spiritual purpose behind all these things. And now you have the understanding of your own self-realization and how you're going to achieve it by practicing the priesthood. And so it gives you sort of, you're benedicted with this breadth of vision of your purpose, and and essentially now you're a priest. Like the final doorway has been passed. And so in order to do that, also in order to become a priest, you have to take an oath, right? There's, you're initiated into a certain spiritual society, and then you have to take oaths that you're not going to do anything that's prohibited. No, for example, sex outside of marriage, or whatever it may be. These various principles of cleanliness and personal behavior, you vow to follow certain rules. And this is really what separates the priesthood from the general people, because the general people will just, they'll do just like in today. You have your average person, and then you have people who are priests and nuns and religious people who are actually initiated into a certain process, and they refrain from certain activities that common people may do. Now, in order to be initiated into these schools, you had to have both certain standards of physical health and purity, as well as standards of behavior. So you would probably go to a doctor, before you're accepted into the priesthood, and they would check you out, give you a physical, and make sure that you're up to it. And part of this may be because when you're worshiping the deity, it's like you can't be, say for example, one of the warnings is that you have pus coming from your skin and stuff like that. Like you can't have these kinds of problems and be in the sacred place, in the holiest of holies, and kind of like this restricted area where one is actually touching the deity. And then your behavior has to be proper, right? Some of the things mentioned is that you can't be a drunkard, right? You can't be greedy about possessions. Now, this may be because, in other words, like people have to know you and attest to your character that you are not a greedy person and you're not after power and position and money. Because if you are, you disturb the whole priesthood, right? In fact, you see in the Middle Ages in Europe, when it was like there was, for example, the second-born son of a family, he had no prospects in life. The firstborn son got all the inheritance. And so oftentimes they would just become monks or priests, because they had nothing else they could do, and it lent some level of prestige to the family or something. But basically they weren't even religious. It was a material endeavor, and it really degraded the priesthood. And this is what individuals like St. Francis and stuff, these reformers, were against this sort of thing, because you have materialists posing as spiritualists. So in order to join the priesthood, you genuinely had to be a spiritual person. You can't have some ulterior motive, and nor can you be greedy. It's like you have to have an attitude of sharing, because the priests live simply. And therefore you have to be very gentle, very humble, and you can't be fighting with all the other priests, and you can't be after money and, disturbing people, sort of misrepresenting the cult and misrepresenting the deity by being a greedy, sort of money-grubbing priest, right? And the priests shouldn't be fighting over money. They should be sharing everything and kind of living in harmony. Nor can you be arrogant, is another one. You can't be quarreling. So it's very common that religious institutions, and especially in temples and things like that, oftentimes they're hotbeds of gossip and quarreling and politics. So that wasn't needed. If you're seen as an individual that liked to fight with people and liked to cause all sorts of problems, then you wouldn't be led into the priesthood. As well as individuals who would demand authority. They're always trying to rise to a position they're not qualified for. So that's not seen as very good. An individual that's offensive to superiors, right? So you have to, it's a culture, any kind of religious culture you'll see, or any culture in general, there's an element of respect for your seniors, respect for people who are older than you, respect for your parents, mother and father, respect for your teachers, right? So these different persons in society are expected to be respected. So if you are in, like the priesthood, you should respect your seniors, those individuals that initiate you and bring you upward and give you the spiritual knowledge. You have to have a certain attitude towards them. And so unless you're able to participate in that type of culture, you wouldn't be accepted. As well as thieves, if you had a history of being a thief or a fornicator, you like to sleep with men or women outside of your husband and wife, and so this is considered degraded. And so also it mentions individuals who worship deities like Set and Apophis, right? Who is, Set, of course, is almost like the, he's the bad guy of the Egyptian pantheon, right? He's the brother of Osiris, and he murdered Osiris and scattered his body throughout Egypt. And all the parts were collected and brought together and embalmed, right? And Osiris was able to then sort of come back from the dead and sire Horus with Isis. And then Horus grew up amidst great peril, protected by his mother Isis, and finally defeated Seth, and so he's like the great hero of the Egyptian pantheon. And so Seth is really, worshipping Set is it's like a taint on your character. It's almost like devil worship or something, right? And then in the modern sort of Judeo-Christian worldview. And then Apophis is the embodiment of chaos. He's opposed to the divine order, or Mat, right? You have kind of the divine order established by the gods, and Apophis is always trying to destroy it. He's always trying to tear it apart and devour it. Also, this element of chaos opposed to divine order, similar to the Western concept of Satan. He's a giant serpent. He's an enemy of Ra, the sun god. And when the sun god is going down in the west, and he's just reaching the horizon, then it's understood that Apophis, this gigantic serpent, is just waiting there under the horizon. He's kind of imprisoned in the underworld, and he awaits at the gateway for the sun to enter, then he attacks him. In fact, the priests of Ra at this time, as the sun is setting, they would all be chanting mantras, and it was considered that their mantras to Ra were giving him the power to defeat Apophis, right? Like the power, the god was, you might say he's filled with, like a lightning type, like a lightning bolt, shocks you and fills you with power. So, the chanting of these priests that empowers Ra to defeat this humongous, all-devouring enemy of the gods, who is a manifestation of chaos, right? And so there were individuals that worship these deities, and they're considered it's almost like black magic or something, right? So they wouldn't be allowed into the priesthood. And an individual had to practice personal cleanliness. They had to bathe 3 times a day. They would also shave their head for cleanliness, right? Like you see the Egyptian tradition, the priests would shave their body because hair was considered impure. It's considered like a byproduct of the body, or kind of just like, you'd pass urine or stool, your body's getting rid of waste, so hair is another form of waste that the body exudes through the skin. So the priests would shave their head. And they would always wear linen cloth, something like cotton. Leather and wool were forbidden. And in the Hindu practices in India, it's still the same thing. Leather is forbidden, obviously, because it's the skin of an animal, and then wool is forbidden because it's hair, and hair is impure. You may be able to wear hair, like in the Indian traditions. A priest may be able to wear wool like in his own time, but he can't wear it in the temple because the hair comes off and it gets all over the place, and so it's considered impure. It's like a contamination. And similar also to the Indian tradition, there's no shoes in the temple. Like if you go to an Indian temple, you take off your shoes, even in a home, for example. Whereas in the Egyptian tradition, it's the same thing. No shoes were allowed in the temple. And before individuals would begin their service in the temple, like a priest would take up maybe he's doing a particular form of worship for a month or something. So before that, there'd be a 10-day period of purification, and there would be no sex during that time, and he would also cleanse his mouth. Like he'd basically use mouthwash and every day, like a sort of ancient Egyptian form of mouthwash. And he'd rinse his mouth every day, because the idea is that you're going to be interacting with the deity, and you should be very clean, right? In fact, also within the Indian tradition, the priests are supposed to keep their mouth clean, because you're not supposed to go to the deity with bad breath, right? And there's also a tradition that when one speaks to their guru, the young student would hold his hand in front of his mouth when speaking. And the implication is that you don't want to breathe your bad breath on someone, right? And so, priests had to be very considerate of their personal cleanliness and their attire, the clothes they're wearing, as well as, even things like their breath. So all of these things had to be pure. And the priests, similar also to the Indian tradition, were mostly vegetarian. I think, of course, they did eat some forms of meat, but for the most part, they were vegetarian. And interestingly enough, they were circumcised, right? The priesthood of Egypt was circumcised just like in Judaism. And this process was outlawed by the Romans, but even into sort of like the Christian era, the Egyptian priests were still allowed to do it. They were given permission by the Romans because it's kind of part of their religious practice. And the Romans would generally honor the religious rituals and temples of the peoples that they ruled. So some of these initiation rites for the priest, and they went through these intricate ceremonies. Some of them are preserved in the Book of the Dead in chapter 17. But generally speaking, these things are secrets. And so another qualification of a potential priest or initiate is they have to be able to keep secrets. And because see the way that the priests, the cult thought of these rituals is that they essentially, as we've mentioned before, it's like you're tuning into the frequency of that god. We've mentioned a couple times now. It's just like a radio station. Each god has their particular radio station. Ra is at 99.5 FM. And so you can tune into that with your CB radio and start talking. And if you tune into it, then Ra will hear you, and he may interact with you. Right, and you can hear him as well. So it's like you're tuning into the energy of that God, and you're able to communicate with him. And that particular frequency is the God. It's not that he's also on the frequency; he is the frequency. And the prayers, and there's certain prayers and certain symbols and things like that actually they're coming from the God, and they're non-different from the God. They are the God. This mantra, this ritual, this symbol, it is the God, and so it is on his frequency. And when you interact with that, or you sort of like try to establish communication with the God through that authorized process, then it's a very loud, powerful calling out to him. It's like your voice is coming in loud and clear on the frequency. And so these things were kept secret, because if they get out into the general public, then all of a sudden you have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people trying to tune into that frequency. And it's like they're creating a lot of static, they're creating a lot of noise on the frequency. And basically they're speaking, and say you just have like some housewife, all of a sudden, she lost her keys and now she's trying to contact Ra or something. And she heard about this ritual, or she got a scrap of papyrus with the ritual written on it, and now she's chanting those mantras. And it's like her voice is there on the frequency. It's not very strong because she's not very expert, and she doesn't know the ritual and everything like that. She's not on the level of the priest in performing the ritual. And yet, because she's using it, it's like, her voice is kind of coming in and out, right? And so if there's enough noise on the frequency, first of all, then it's kind of like the God will stop listening. He'll stop paying so much attention, and it's almost like it'll be abandoned over time. Those symbols and things like that, they'll lose their power, right? Sometimes it'll be said that if too many people use this, it'll lose its power. That's why. It's not like it just gets worn down or something. It's because it's like that channel becomes flooded with noise, and then that channel becomes abandoned. And so the priests wanted to preserve these very sacred pathways of communication with the gods and not let them sort of be torn apart by the public or misused by the public, right? And there's also the element, of course, where if you introduce these sacred names of the gods to the public, they become profane. The biblical saying, casting pearls before swine, that all of a sudden people start, you introduce people to the sacred name of Ra, or something like that, or the sacred name of Thoth, and then all of a sudden they're using it to cuss. A guy stubs his toe and, rah, 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 Thoth, rah, 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 you know what I mean? And the God hears that, and all of a sudden he's got on his frequency all these people like, using foul language and husband and wife arguing, calling each other names mixed in with his name. And it's like the God is going to think like, what's going on with these priests? I gave them all these symbols, and look what's happened. I gave them this sacred, my phone number basically, and they gave it to everybody, right? Like you'll see these celebrities, oftentimes this happens. Like they have a cell phone number, and then somehow or other it gets around. Like they gave it to maybe 20 or 30 people, and all of a sudden it's made its way to like hundreds of people have it, and all sorts of people are calling all the time, and then that celebrity gets mad, like, hey, I gave you this phone number, why did you give it to people? And so it's the same thing with the gods, right? And of course, the supreme God, or God himself, or the one transcendent deity, it's not quite the same. He's not limited in his frequency. Rather, anybody can pray to him from any place at all times. So you'll find in those traditions sometimes then, such things are given out freely. Traditions dealing with the one transcendent God. And another interesting thing is because these were secret, then the priests would write down the ritual to remember it, but they would write it down in code. They would write something that doesn't make any sense, or they would substitute the name of something for something else. For example, you're supposed to perform this ritual, and all of a sudden it says, you're supposed to use the semen of Hercules, or you're supposed to use the eye of a bat, like you'd find in these sort of magical Middle-Age European traditions, Eye of Newt and all these sort of Shakespearean archetypes. So you'd find these kind of strange formulas, but that's not really what the formula is. That's just like the priests know when it says Eye of Bat, it means, this particular flower or this particular mantra or something like that, this particular prayer. And so they knew kind of the inner meaning of these rituals. And that was to throw off the public. So if somehow or other this papyrus or this piece of the ritual, it gets out into the public domain, then people will be performing all these bogus rituals which don't do anything. If you start mixing semen of Hercules and eye of bat, then nothing's going to happen, and then people will kind of give up. And that's really what they wanted, And also the Egyptian language itself was very difficult to translate. It's, translating Egyptian to Greek, for example, was considered a very difficult task because there's many subtleties that you just can't communicate. And so it was deliberately made that way. The Egyptians kept their language deliberately sacred or hard to translate so that outsiders wouldn't be able to have access to these kind of secret pathways towards divinity. Now, the result of this is that over time, these things are pretty much lost. Even up until the 400 years after the birth of Christ in the 5th century, these formulas were largely gone. And with the rise of Christianity, of course, then it kind of consumed the ancient Egyptian traditions, whatever was left. And even by that time, it only existed in some families. Like occasionally there'll be a mention that there's this particular family of priests. Rather than, having thousands of people who are trained in the priesthood, there's just this particular family that still knows something, They've kind of handed it down generation after generation, some of this sacred information. And individuals within these families would then be, they would develop reputations, like 2 twin boys or something are born into this family, and they have clairvoyant power or divination, so divinatory power. So even during the time of Christianity, you would find, this particular family, individuals might come and request for some kind of, reading or something like that, or some form of divination. And they claimed to be the forebearers of this once great religion, which now existed in only dwindling temples. And there are some texts from late antiquity, from the Greco-Roman period, which claim to preserve these Egyptian secrets of these initiation cults, or at least some of those secrets, or, a kernel of truth embedded within them. And you'll find them in the magical papyri. There's various smatterings of rituals and things like that were used at that time, but which may echo or hearken back to an earlier time of Egyptian worship. For example, you have the Mithras liturgy. You also have the Chaldean oracles. And this book that we've actually been discussing, The Egyptian Mysteries by Iamblichus, it's a similar thing, it's kind of showing or giving us a glimpse of what the ancient Egyptian religion was like, but it's also seen through the lens of late antiquity. Therefore, it's, including elements of Gnosticism and Christianity. And especially it's kind of looking at it through a Neoplatonic or Platonic lens, very much to like Greek philosophy. But still, if we look through the text, we can find, a glimpse into this sort of dark, smoky temples of ancient Egypt and what their life was like and what these initiation ceremonies were like, and really the powerful experiences that they had interacting with the supernatural. So thank you very much for listening to Gods, Demons, and Magic. We hope that you found some illumination, and it was certainly a learning experience for me. I learned a lot, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity, and so I'm grateful also for everyone who listens. So thank you very much.